It's YouTube Wednesday! Today's project is Lobster Boy. This is going to be a complete sculpt, mold, pull, pour, paint, everything on this one particular project. Right now I'm using water-based clay on a plaster sculpting armature, and I am building it up to the level that I want, just with the clay. You can see my tools there on the right a little bit in front of my little bucket of water there. When my arm is not in the way, that is. Mostly what I'm using for tools is popsicle sticks. I keep a pair of scissors near me when I'm sculpting, and I just cut different angles into the end of the popsicle sticks, and that gives me different gouges to use on this particular project. Right here I'm putting in holders for the antenna, because this is Lobster Boy. He's going to have lobster-like antenna coming off of him. I don't want to put those in the sculpt because that would be very difficult to mold. However, I do want to put in a holder for them because I know what I'm using. And here I'm just finishing out the plates, and I want to make it look segmented like a lobster. And after a while, I'm going to put a bunch of up and down runs in the back of the head. And what those are for is those will allow the latex to accordion in and out and fit different sized heads. Just adding some texture by stippling on a brush because I don't want it perfectly smooth. Adding in a little bit more mouth detail. And now I'm just taking little bits of clay and making little scutes, almost like an alligator's back, and putting those up on top. A few more gouges, add a few more details. This is a mask that's going to be for one of the haunts that screams. It's going into the Uncle Coy's Clown Maze, which kind of has a genetic type carnival theme. So there's clowns and other critters. Some animal hybrid mixed people, all in circusy attire. And I want this actor to be able to make a lot of noise, so there's the finished sculpt. I'm doing a jawless piece. That just means with paint, I want it to stay pretty close to skin tone, so the jaw doesn't stand out. Okay, putting on the mold wall. I'm not using the whole plaster head, so what I'm basically doing is building a little dam around the bottom of it, leaving only about a 1/4 inch of plaster showing underneath of the head. And here you can really see how that latex is going to accordion when this mask is in latex form. I spent 33 minutes on the sculpt total. This part here is kind of awesome for people who already make mask molds. These are plastic playing cards that I get at Party City. They're about $6 a pack, and they're meant so you can play cards or poker in the swimming pool. But they also make great quick mold walls. This is sped up about 2 times, maybe 3, but the whole mold wall took me maybe 15 minutes to make. So as far as making mold walls, this is much faster than doing it out of clay. It does leave a little bit of a ridge in the sculpture from where you push in the cards. On this piece, it's not a big deal, and it normally shows up as a thin line of plaster inside of the mold, and you can just flake that off. Here I'm painting the sculpture with black spray paint, which is going to put a thin plastic film between the clay and the plaster. Clay is water-based and plaster is water-based, so they'll move moisture back and forth from each other if you let them. The plastic is a little bit of a barrier, and spray paint is basically acrylic or plastic, so it makes a good barrier. I've used hairspray. Here I've mixed up the plaster. I've mixed that up to a pancake batter-like consistency, and I'm just painting it all over the mold. I need to be very careful to avoid air bubbles, because the last thing that you want is trapped air. I want to make sure that no air bubbles are in there. I kind of see one right now watching the video that I missed before. Let's see if I fix it later. It's on the bottom right corner of the mold. where the mold wall meets the sculpture. It's a little black dot. That means that there's no, and it looks like I covered right over it, but maybe I squeezed the air out of it. Who knows? I have this whole video sped up a bit so that I can get the whole process to you. That way you guys can see everything. As my plaster is hardening and thickening, I am using my hand to spread it on like it's a trowel. I'll get a good bit on, and then I'll scrape it off on the mold wall also. When you are building up your sculpture, it's good to make a flat top on the mold. I'm not quite there yet. I'll need to mix another batch for that, I bet. But it's very good to have a flat top, because when you pour it up, you want it to sit on its top. Now, you could sit it inside of a 5-gallon bucket or inside of a milk crate, and I do that a lot. But it helps to have the top pretty flat also. And I am probably mixing up another batch. I'm smoothing out this batch so the next batch sits. And I'm getting rid of that last bit of plaster. You also want to keep a smooth surface to your mold so that you don't get air bubbles in your mold. Air bubbles are bad. They're weakness. You either want plaster there or latex there or something. So I am, again, troweling on more. And small air bubbles at this stage, it's so far out of the mold that it doesn't really matter that much. So it's not as big of a deal. Right up against the surface, you'll lose your detail. But right here, I have added, you can see I added a bunch of plaster to the top to kind of flatten it out a little bit. And I don't know if I'm making more or not. This was shot about a month and a half ago. Okay, I'm smoothing out my mold now. I'm just hitting it with some water and with a little pot scraper and a brush to get it smooth. And now I'll take a piece of wet burlap and just rub it down. And that way I can rub it all down and get it nice and smooth. I'm prepping it for the second half. So far I've got 33 minutes in it for the sculpt and 37 for that back half of the mold. And here I am. Remember, those cards were taped with duct tape on both sides. That kind of smoothed out the mold wall a little bit and helped line them up. Well, that also really helps get them off. And you can see I've got a nice smooth mold wall. I don't have keys, but there's a little bit of stair stepping that happens from the playing cards, even through the duct tape. And I don't know why I'm dancing there. I have no idea. And that stair stepping kind of helps act as a lock. I am adding, I think it's like Walmart brand Pam cooking spray. Or whatever, great value. Look, great value vegetable spray. And I'm painting it onto the eyes because the eyes are plaster, and that little lip down there at the bottom. That is my barrier in between layers. Anywhere there's plaster, I got to put that on. Next, I am making and putting on pry points. Those pry points are essential to cracking the mold later on. Because when both halves are stone, there's no way to get a tool inside to pry them apart. So those being there, the screwdriver fits in. And once again, I'm painting it in black spray paint, which is that barrier. And I want to get a good even coat. And I just put on a little bit more cooking spray just to be cautious. And here I am painting the face. Now I always do the back first because on some pieces I want to lay it down so gravity helps me fill in all the voids on the face. I don't necessarily need to do that right now on this piece because it's a shorter mask. It's only a half mask. It only covers half the head. But I can paint it in and paint it up and get it in all those details. Full head mask, I would definitely want to do the back and lay it down. And again, I need to really avoid air bubbles because those kill my detail. And everybody sees that air bubble right now under the eye, and I'm hoping I take care of that. Again, this was a ways out from show opening, and you can see that I'm pretty busy. A lot of action going on in the shop. It looks like I'm keeping that air bubble there, and you'll probably get to see a fix for that because I'll catch it later, I have no doubt. But right now I'm just using the plaster to smooth everything out. Time has gone by, it has hardened a little bit. I've mixed up some more, but now I've got a bamboo skewer, and I chipped away the pieces that were blocking making that air bubble. So then I can put plaster inside of there like I did and fix that air bubble. Because you don't want trapped air. I had to break a little piece of the mold away to get to it. Mixed up a good thick batch now. I've got a thicker batch going on, and I can use that in order to build up a good thickness of the mold and rapidly get this puppy into cracking open shape. Each half of the mold is going to take about 40 minutes, and that's kind of me flying. Plan on 3 hours for in between layers and whatnot for a mold. I don't use, in my molds, I don't use burlap or hemp really anymore. If it was a heavy-duty production mold where I needed 50 pulls out of it, I would, possibly. But I just don't anymore. I just don't think it's worth the risk. I mean, not the risk, the time. I don't think it's worth the time. Because if you drop a mold, I don't care if it has burlap in it or not, it's breaking. And that's how I've always broken them. Alright, it's cracking the mold time. Use my pry point, put a screwdriver in, tapped it with a short hammer, and here I'm just prying the clay around off of it. Kyle is peeling the clay out of the back of the head, and I am freeing the face from the mold. What happens is you have a lot of suction. It's wet clay up against plaster, and you really have to pull to get that suction apart most of the time. So now I am cleaning up the front, and Kyle is cleaning out the back of the mold. This is a tedious process just about always, and this is actually coming out pretty good. It's kind of coming out in sheets because the plastic is such a good barrier, the spray paint. But basically, there's this stage where you're pulling out the big chunks as much as you can. Then we'll need to power wash it. And the power washing is what really gets it nice and clean. As we clean out the mold, it's just leaving piles and piles of clay on the table. It is important to clean those up. In between sessions, I have not always been cleanly. Here's Kyle washing out the mold. He's just hitting it with a hose. This is a small mold. A big mold with a ton of detail, we might need to power wash it. But like I was saying, clean up in between every stage. It just helps. You won't want to work in a dirty workshop. I know I don't. This is a long view of a Dr. Pepper machine with nothing going on. Hey, look, we're back to the action. Here's the mold that we are still cleaning out. Detail, detail, detail. Most likely what's causing us the problem is those antenna that I put on there, the holders for the antenna, because those stuck out about 2 inches. So now it's a little piece 2 inches deep inside of clay. And you can kind of see that's right where I'm working and where Kyle is working peeling clay out of there. Now he's got a little copper wire, and you can bend that into different pieces. You can use a piece of an old coat hanger. You can use, just a bit of electrical wire. But a bendable piece of wire, so you can bend it and change the angles, is very helpful. Don't scrape it against the sides too much, because the metal is stronger than the plaster, and it could scratch your mold, which would be a little raised piece. And you can see him kind of fiddling with the wire there to get it bent into just the right shape to have it reach where he needs to reach. This is not riveting television, but I did want to show you guys the full process. There's the mold all cleaned out. I'm putting it together. I have put a mold banding strap around it. You kind of hold those closed with a screwdriver. That really helps. Fairly flat head, but I'm using that little hammer in order to balance it. Here I am pouring latex into the mold. Alright, and I'm painting up the sides. And I'm painting it into the seam. If it is in the seam longer than anywhere else, then it's not going to leak, because it's going to dry in the seam first. And now I roll it around to make sure there's no air bubbles. You can trap air by pouring it in. Here I filled it all the way up, and now it has to sit there. The longer it sits with latex in it, full up to the top like that, the thicker the mask is going to be. I want this to be pretty thick and to survive a haunted house cast. So I left it in there for an hour. That's a good thick mask. And now I'm draining it. I set it above the bucket and I drain it for about 10 minutes. Now I'm carrying it outside after it's drained for 10 minutes. You can see it's full of white latex. Oh, look at that. It's the next day. It is sat outside. It has changed from white in color to being yellow in color. And it's ready to pull. I have some dollar store baby powder right there, because I am frugal. On a 1-inch chip brush, and I'm just brushing it in and around. Latex will stick to itself. The powder is a barrier. And now I'm just pulling out the mask, which is pretty much a finished mask except for trimming and painting. Get my handy dandy scissors. I recommend shorter scissors than this. These long scissors are kind of hard to control, especially when you're going into eyes and nostrils and such and cutting them out. Harbor Freight has a great pair of red-handled short scissors that are great for trimming. And I know I have them in the shop somewhere, I just didn't bother trying to find them. And I am trimming out the eyes. And it's important that you really look at what you're doing, because you cannot untrim a mask. It is very hard to add latex to it. Now I'm trimming out my little antenna pieces so I can get my antenna set in there later. This is Lobster Boy. He needs some weird antenna-like appendages coming off of his face. There we go. You can kind of see a bit of the black paint left over on that mask. It would not be on any of the others. This is just the first pull, so it's also called the cleaning pull most of the time. I have to powder my hands before I put gloves on because I have fat hands. But the cleaning pull gets little bits of clay and anything in your mold you don't want on your regular pulls out. I normally use my cleaning pull. Some people don't. And I have a brown latex paint mixed up that is just latex house paint, a little bit of latex, and some water, distilled water. And I'm putting that all over. These are the claw gloves that were mostly sculpted by Kyle. I think he did a great job on them. And then I'm taking a wet towel and I am wiping it off, which gives me a nice antique look. I don't want to go too far off of flesh tone. If I go too crazy far off of a flesh tone, then I'm going to have to do a lot of work to the actor's face. This is a jawless mask. So hands and face, I both want them to be kind of in the realm of flesh tone. That's why I'm going with a brown instead of a black. Just getting things antiqued. And you can kind of see where that accordion area I was talking about. It fits in with the character here, but it's also very practical for making it fit over different sized heads. And there's my wet towel, and you can see that black stripe a little bit. That's not a big enough deal to stop me from using that in the haunted house. Okay. I'm using a backer rod, which is insulation material. You get it at Home Depot. That's going to be my antenna. I just hot glue those in place, and then I'm just painting those brown as well, just so they kind of blend in a bit. And that is basically Lobster Boy, but I do want to add some red tones in to get him a little bit more lobstery. I'm opening up a pre-mixed kind of a mauve rose color, which is, again, latex paint, water, and some casting latex. I don't always put casting latex in it, and I don't always thin it down with water. But it's stretchier if you put a little bit of latex in it. And you can see that's just really ruddying up the latex. And it's a good blending tone in between the super pale of the latex and the brown of the antique. For the claws, we only molded one. So it's, because it doesn't have a thumb or anything, so we can use one mold and just pull 2 copies. I wanted to add some red onto it. I didn't have any regular red. I'm just using some red spray paint. I sprayed it out on the table, and then I'm dry brushing it onto the hands. Use what you have. This close to show opening, red is in short supply because a lot of things get blooded up or red just added for the flesh tone. When I'm painting them, I normally try to leave the palms fairly clean, so it's a lighter colored palm. That way if the actor reaches out towards someone from a dark spot, it's a more dramatic effect because of the lightness. They can see that coming at them in the dark. I have paint all over my hand, obviously, because that's how I roll, despite the fact that I was wearing gloves. This is Lobster Boy. One thing left to do now. You have seen him from sculpt to paint. All I've got to do now, because it's in my shop, is mark him off of my list. Lobster Boy is done. Thanks for watching.